Willkommen in einem anderen aufregendes Video, or welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 3 of my Pre-Stag series of videos, in this case discussing the conversion of DBMM troop types into a Pre-Stag format. Pre-Stags is a series of board games published by SPI back in the 1970s. This video is only of any value if you are using figures on a figure gaming playing area, either with hexes or using a hexless system and the necessary rules changes to allow the hexless system to work. The objective is to allow players to use the DBMM army list to play a Pre-Stags game. Initially the hex version, and later when I get around to it I'll publish a hexless version of the Pre-Stags rules. Pre-Stags means pre-17th century tactical game system. The game system took a number of earlier SPI games, Armageddon, Phalanx, Centurion, Dark Ages and Renaissance of Infantry, and standardised all the games so they use the same basic game system. Before we go into any details of the DBMM troop types and how to convert them to a Pre-Stag format, I need to determine a method to convert a troop type points value into its component movement and combat values. The reason will become clear as we progress through the video. Now, the standard method used in Pre-Stag is to take half the melee value, rounded up, adding this to any fire strength value, and that gives you what's called a VP, or a points value. Thus, a PS unit, or professional spearman, such as Spartan, has a value of 2 points, and a skirmish unit has a value of 3 points. Pre-Stags uses these values for their panic rules, and after playing a number of games I feel they are not an accurate depiction of a unit's combat value for the purpose of creating a points-based system. I feel adding the full melee value to its fire value is more accurate, with units with different attack and defense melee values being averaged out. In this system, the PS, or let's say Spartan Hoplite, has a value of 4 points and the skirmish unit has a value of 3.5 points. This does not seem like a big difference, but does it balance melee value with fire values in a more accurate manner? Now we come down to why I need an accurate points system for Pre-Stag, and the reason is I need to align this up with DBMM troop type points systems. Thus, the objective is to be able to use a standard DBMM army list and create an army using the DBMM points system. In order to make this work, I need to ensure the troop type has a usefulness equivalent to its points value. So, in summary, the principle I'll be using is that the DBMM points value must represent an element's combat ability, such as melee strength, fire range and movement. If we look at a regular spearman, ordinary, which has a points cost of 5 points, this has to be translatable to a tangible combat effect. For now, let's assume being regular has a points value of 1 point. The actual story is a little bit more complex and we'll be looking at that in more detail, but for this exercise, imagine it's 1 point. So that absorbs 1 point of the regular ordinary spearman's 5 points. We're left with 4 points to allocate to melee and movement. Okay, the first assumption that we need to make is because this number, that is 4 points, is so low, we would probably assume the movement allowance of the unit represents a baseline which has no value. Thus, a regular spearman in Pre-Stags has a movement allowance of 3 MPs. We would assume this has a value of 0 points. If it was greater, then that would have a points value, but at 3 MPs, that's the baseline, 0 points. This still leaves us with 4 points, which would need to be fully allocated to the element's melee strength. If we use a ratio of 1:1, then we end up with 4 melee strength points. A fire combat unit is a little bit more complex, so let's look at one, in this case a Siloy unit. Now Siloy is basically a skirmisher in Pre-Stag, and when you look at the points here, which are DBMM points, there's no difference between regular or irregular, so there's no points allocation for that. Now in Pre-Stags, a standard skirmisher unit has a fire strength points value of 2. Thus, if we use a ratio of 1:1, then this is worth 2 points. if this was an ordinary skirmish unit, then this aligns with DBMM's 2 points, as you can see here. But I must admit, in Pre-Stags, this unit, that is a skirmish unit in Pre-Stag, does have a melee value. Now, we have no points left over for this, so the melee value has to be 0. Okay, let's look at a superior silo unit. Now, if we look at a superior silo unit with the same missile values, then we do have a 1 point left over, which could be allocated to a melee value, such as, let's say, 2 attack melee, which aligns with Pre-Stags, and 0 defense melee, which doesn't exactly align, but is probably good enough. Now, this does not match up with the Pre-Stag unit values, but it does align with DBMM points value, which is really what we're attempting to simulate here. We're not trying to take DBMM units and trying to ram it into the Pre-Stag unit values. What we're trying to do is we're trying to look at the DBMM units, looking at its points value, and then directly calculating or converting that into combat values which can be used in a game of Pre-Stags. Generally, I think in this case, these values would probably work quite well. So let's look at a specific unit in a little bit more detail. If we look at a regular Siloi ordinary, which has a points cost of 2 points in DBMM, how do we translate this into a tangible combat effect? Now, as I indicated earlier, for this troop type in DBMM, there's no difference in points terms between regular and irregular, so we'll assume that being regular has 0 points. Now, once again, because we have such a low number, that is 2 points left over, we would need to assume the standard movement allowance for this silo unit is basically 5. Now, in Pre-Stag, it's 5 MPs. We assume that's a base level and it has 0 points value. As these elements mainly fight using fire weapons and is at a major disadvantage if caught in melee, thus it needs a high movement allowance in order to make this troop type viable. Thus, the standard movement allowance of 5 MP is quite reasonable, and this should be assumed to be a base rate for this unit type. Thus, we don't need to allocate a points value. A lot of assumptions being made here, but it seems to work when I ended up spreadsheeting all of this. Now, we have to assume, again because of there only being 2 points, that the melee value is 0, so thus there is no cost for melee strength. This leaves us 2 points for fire unit or missile capacity. Thus, we can allow this unit to have a fire combat strength of 2 at a cost of 2 points. Now, the range, if javelin, would be 1 base width or 1 hex, which again represents a base value. That is, this is the base range for all missile units and has a 0 points value. Ranges beyond 1 hex or 1 base width has a points value. So as a result, we end up with a regular Siloi ordinary worth 2 points, it having a melee value of 0 and a missile value of 2 with a missile range of 1. Let's look at regular versus irregular and how that's dealt with within Pre-Stags. Now, there is a points difference in DBMM, so we need to have some difference in Pre-Stags to reflect that points difference. Now, the simple solution would be to assume the leader radius in Pre-Stags is reduced by 1 hex or 1 base width if the troops are irregular, and the leader radius is standard if the troop types are regular. Now, this actually solves our regular versus irregular issue very neatly and cleanly. But now let's take a look at what are the costs of being regular versus irregular. This chart shows all the regular elements in DBMM by points value. On the left, this starts at 1 point, and on the right it ends at 15 points. That is, the element value starts at 1 point per element, and there is an element which is 15 points 15 points per element. Now, this is the blue line. The red line represents the points difference between regular and irregular. Thus, if an element has a points value of 1 to 3, the cost difference between regular and irregular is 0. One minor exception, but it's 0. If the points costs range from 4 to 6 or 7, the difference is 1 point. If the points range, that is per element, from 7 to 13, the difference is 2 points, and if the element has a 15-point value, the difference is 3 points. In summary, the cost of being regular depends on the points value of the element. I see the reason why this is the case in DBMM. I mean, I see the logic behind it, but how do we actually translate this into something we can use with pre-stags? Look, while it's possible to have a simple formula to determine the cost of regular, because I have all the required data from the DBM rulebooks, I can actually simply use the actual points value difference that's in DBMM. This gives me the number of points left over to allocate to combat and movement factors. So in summary, the points value of being regular is dependent on the difference between regular and irregular within DBMM, and does vary by the troop types, or primarily the value of the troop types. Okay, it's not a clean system, you can't do it in your head, you have to look at a chart, but you know what? It gives me a comparatively accurate system based on DBMM points values. Before we get into combat values, we need to allocate points for movement. And actually allocating a points value for movement is rather tricky, as we've kind of seen in our examples earlier. The basic principle I will use is that each troop type has a standard base movement allowance. So for close order infantry, this would be 3 movement points, which allows you to cover 3 hexes in clear, or 3 base widths if using a hexless system. And for skirmish infantry, this would be 5 MPs. The points cost is 0 for this standard base movement allowance, and will cost 1 point per additional MP if the unit or element has a greater movement allowance. Using the optional rules in pre-stags, movement allowance can be very important in melee, as a greater allowance allows you to retreat from melee combat. Troop types which are not designed for melee need this greater movement, and troops designed for melee can use movement allowances to select when they engage in melee. So it's actually built in. The movement allowance in pre-stags is something that's built into the combat system, and that is why we need a points value for it, and that's why the base for different troop types do vary, because different troop types actually operate in very different ways. Anyway, that's my spin on it. Others may disagree. Thus, what are the base movement values? Now, the troops which are primarily designed for melee has a base movement allowance of 3, and each MP greater than this costs 1 additional point. Now, the troop types are, as you can see here, elephants, which I threw in for a variety of reasons, spearmen, pike, and blade. In pre-stags, professional spear or pike have a greater movement allowance than lower quality infantry. Swordsmen also have a greater movement allowance, with barbarian infantry the greatest movement allowance. I suspect this difference is to reflect the different flexibility of each troop type, which is reasonable and something we will try and use. We do have an issue with pike, as in DBMM, pike can fight in greater depth, thus each element is a reasonably low value. As we are using a DBMM army list, we will have to live with this, but perhaps we can provide a greater stacking for pike units. Now, another solution that we have for pike units is that every 2 pike elements gets merged into a single element within your pre-stag system, thus all values are doubled. And that actually solves the problem quite nicely, or alternatively you just create a greater stacking for pike compared to others. Let's now look at troop types which have a base movement allowance of 4. Now, bow, while being a fire combat troop type, can engage in melee if required. So, in this case, the base movement is 4 MPs, and anything greater costs 1 point per MP. As it turns out, pretty much all the bow have a movement allowance of 4, with one exception in the conversions that I'll show you at the end. Now let's take a look at infantry units which have a base movement rate of 5 MP. Now, after thinking about this long and hard, Warband, Auxilia, and Siloy I've grouped together into this area. Now, Warbands and Auxilia basically are treated the same as fire combat troops in terms of movement allowance, as their combat abilities do rely on their speed. Thus, for all these 3 troop types, we have a base movement rate of 5 MPs. Siloy, obviously being skirmisher, would need this in order to avoid melee, but so does the other two troop types. That's why I've grouped them all together here. Now let's take a look at artillery, which I've given a base movement value of 2 MP, simply because this is the best way to reflect their high cost in DBMM. This is mainly due to the cart-mounted artillery, which has a very high points cost in DBMM. Thus, I need to allocate a lot of points towards its mobility, which I suppose is, the same situation in DBMM as well. Its high cost is because of its mobility, basically. One thing I've noticed in DBMM is how high the cost for some troop types are, such as regular knights, ordinary, which have a cost of 12 points. So does this mean they are more than twice as powerful in melee as regular spearmen ordinary, such as hoplites, which have a cost of 5 points? I suspect part of this points value is related to their mobility, which is certainly something we'll be using in our point system, but I do find some of the points values in DBMM interesting. I'm not suggesting they're wrong, I'm just suggesting they're rather interesting. Okay, let's take a look at mounted. In this case, we're looking at troops which have a base movement allowance of 6 MP, which happens to be mounted, knights, cavalry, and expendable. For our higher speed troop types, light horse, I've given them a base MP of 7 MP. Now, there is a lot of gut feel occurring here, and players are free to use their own gut feel calculation if they so desire. Now, let's get into the gritty aspect of the points calculation, starting with melee values. In simple terms, one melee strength point costs 1 point. If the attack and defence strengths differ, total the two and divide by 2 to arrive at the number of points required. Thus, a 4 attack and 2 defence would cost 3 points. Before we move on to fire combat, let's look at the results of our assumptions so far. Let's start with knight units, which tend to be rather complex. Now, what you see here is their point system. Now, this chart, I must admit, comes from DBM rather than DBMM, but all my calculations in my spreadsheet uses DBMM version 2.1 army lists and rules. And actually, the only difference between this chart and the DBMM 2.1 is bows have a value of 7 points instead of 6 for superior regular. Not sure why, but that's the only real difference. Now, this shows our knights' values according to Pre-Stags. The main area players may decide to modify is the balance between attack and defence melee value. Except for cataphract cavalry, you probably don't want them to work like infantry. Instead, you want them to be sent in for the shock blow, and then being a disadvantage if they stick around. Currently in Pre-Stags, you cannot withdraw from a combat until some results occur, using the optional rules, but perhaps players could insert an optional rules allowing cavalry to withdraw after a number of player turns of melee. Now let's move to cavalry, which is much simpler in many ways than knights. Cavalry works very much similar to knights, except obviously the values are lower. Now, once again, players may wish to change the balance between attack and defence melee values. But the values that you see here allow cavalry to have an impact on the initial impact of melee, but then in subsequent rounds they do not fare very well. Once again, it's probably would be a good idea to have a withdraw after, let's say, 2-player term rule. Now we move on to one of the weirdest troop types in DBMM, expendables. Now these are one-shot weapon systems. The defence value you see here is only used if caught by enemy elements in melee. Otherwise, I assume they're removed after one combat phase. We've completed our mounted, let's move on to foot, starting with spear troops. In this conversion, there's really not much movement, adjustments that you may wish to make. The only adjustment here is that I've made superior spearmen an additional movement point as well as an additional melee value. Some people may decide to give the irregular spearmen superior a melee of 6 and keep them at a movement of 3. But I suspect that this arrangement probably aligns better with the original Pre-Stag intention. While in Pre-Stag, a pike and spearmen are all pretty much guys with big pointy sticks. In DBMM, pikes are very different. So let's look at pikes. Now, unlike pre-stags, I've given pike the same movement allowance as spears. This was to keep their melee strength to a reasonable level. I'd also suggest allowing pikes to stack more than other troops, perhaps twice more, in order to reflect their combat value, because that's really the way they're designed to be used in DBMM. Thus, if you have a stacking of 3 for infantry, now if you're using a hex system, stacking is fairly simple to understand. If you're using a hexal system, that simply means the unit consists of up to 3 elements and no more. Then you could allow a pike unit to stack double this to 6, which means you could stack 6. Now, this gives it a reasonably good melee strength. If they're ordinary, they've got a melee strength of 18 SPs. A spear unit has 12 SPs and a blade 12 SPs as well. So this is probably a reasonable ratio. Personally, I'm not too happy with this because a stacking of 6 makes for some rather unwieldy unit. But in order to align with DBM army lists, we really have no alternative. Now, a simpler system would be that if you use the DBMM army list, for every 2 pike units, you actually merge them into a single pike unit, doubling their melee strength. That way, stacking does not need to have to be changed. Let's now look at blade arm troops. Now, the blade unit is faster than guys with big pointy sticks. Now, in pre-stags, I expect this is due to the troops that, those units or troops can move easier with a sword rather than lugging around a long spear or pike. Now, the exception to this are the latter very heavily armoured blade units. A legionary element, in this case, has a melee strength of 4, which is similar to a spear unit. As legionnaires have a movement advantage, they can always withdraw from any spear or pike attack or attempt to engage in melee. So this, I think, flexibility gives them a reasonable advantage, which I suspect is quite historical. Now let's move on to Barbarian Warbands. This shows the warband values. Now, warbands are fast and have a greater attack than defense ability, which is basically built into the pre-stag systems. If players disagree, they can certainly change the values to suit whatever they think warbands should actually represent. Now we'll move on to Auxilia. Now, in pre-stag, Auxilia are similar to Barbarian infantry, although not quite as powerful. They are fast, like Barbarians. They have a better attack than defence, which means they don't have that much staying power. And I think that's probably a reasonable depiction of Auxilia. Now let's move to fire combat. In simple terms, a fire combat strength point of 1 is equal to 1 point. Now, we also need to include range, that is a points value for range. A range of 1 is a base range for any fire combat troops and thus has no cost. Now, for every hex or base width beyond that, we pay 1 additional point. So a bowman at 1 fire strength and 2 hex range costs 2 points. Let's see how this works when we look at the DBM troop types. Now, I'm starting with elephants, not because they're specifically a fire combat unit, but one of the troop types in DBMM does have a fire combat value. That's why I'm putting it here. The points values for elephants in DBM seems very high, so their combat values are much higher than you would expect from the pre-stag elephant unit. I'm sure there's good reasons for this, but at these values, these guys are powerful. Pre-stags does have a rule which can allow these troops to become uncontrollable, so they are difficult to manage, but correctly allocated, these guys can punch through anything. I suspect that you will have to modify their stacking limit to control them, so you avoid them becoming some kind of super troop. Thus, I would suggest elephants should only have a stacking of 1 and can't stack with any other troop types. In terms of missile capacity, one elephant type has a bolt shooter mounted on it. This has a fire strength of 3 and a fire range of 4, as you can see here. Now let's move on to more traditional fire combat troops, light horse. Now these are my estimates for light horse values. Because of the way fire combat occurs, the fire strength is not very high. It cannot be very high, being 1 in all these cases. The range varies based on whether the troop type is armed with bow or javelin. Some light horses are able to engage in melee, so have a melee value. Others have a melee value of 0, which means they don't like engaging in melee. Let's now move on to bow elements. Now in DBMM, bow-armed troops normally fight in some kind of close order, and some of them are able to engage in melee. The long bows have a longer range and poor quality bows have a reduced fire strength, and this is my estimate of the way the values should be aligned accordingly. Now let's move on to our favourite troop type, skirmishers or Sieloi. Now in DBMM, Sieloi are skirmishers, either javelin, sling or bow-armed. Bow-armed have a longer range and high-quality troops have a higher combat strength or fire combat strength. The odd one out are the exceptional skirmishers, which use fire or biological weapons. I assume this is a one-shot weapon system, and and based on their points value, the fire combat must be rather high, incredibly high. Now, just a quick note about fire combat in Pre-Stags. Fire combat works very different from melee, and you don't need a very high value. So a value of 6 is quite exceptional, and these guys can really, hit a very large unit and really affect them very badly, which I suppose if they're using, fire weapons or biological weapons seems quite reasonable. Now let's end on the artillery troop types. The artillery caused me some major issues, and it was only after trying to deal with this that I determined you needed a cost for fire range. Now, this could be due to the way fire combat occurs in Pre-Stags compared to DBMM, which means that fire strength had to be kept low, but nonetheless, fire range is an important points component of artillery. Now, the rest of it I'm not going to deal in any great details. For leaders, a standard leader in DBMM is a L2 leader, a brilliant leader in DBMM is an L1 leader, and an inert leader in DBMM is an L3 leader. Now, there are no DBMM versions for 4, 5 and 6, so we probably can't use them. Alternatively, you could probably create your own points value for L4 at least. I'll leave that up to player. Now, the terrain placement rules are the same as the standard DBMM rules. In fact, pretty much all the other rules are the same as DBMM rules because we're using the DBMM points-based concept. We're only changing the game system from the DBMM game system to the Pre-Stags game system. Now, in summary, using these values, a player could pick up a standard DBMM army list, construct a force mix using a set points value, and use the Pre-Stag game system to have a game. Some of the DBMM rules would need to apply, such as allies and stratagems, but this is a simple way for someone to get into the hobby without them needing to read in any great detail DBMM, which, while I like them as a set of rules, are not the easiest set of rules to learn. Now, currently only the hex-based version of Pre-Stag rules are available, so you will need a hex-based playing area, but I will have a hexless version of the rules available soon, so for players who do not like hexes, they will be able to use a standard playing area in these cases once I print them out. Incidentally, you could probably create your own hexless version. Just download the original Pre-Stag rules, standard rules, and basically replace hexes with base widths and zones of control, again with base widths, and play around with it accordingly. It's a bit tricky in terms of, flank attacks and things of that nature, but, you could have a friendly game quite easy without waiting for anything that I create. Now, this has nothing to do with Pre-Stags or converting the rules or DBMM. This is a special terrain supplement which I decided to add here rather than create a whole separate video. Now, in this case, this is an idea for the creation of water features. One of my major issues has always been the creation of water features and roads. A player suggested I use pool aligners for my water features. But after trying to find some and failing, I decided to try a different approach. Felt-bottomed, thick paper, water feature terrain, which is what you can see here. Now what you see here is a 3 centimetre wide river terrain piece, which is currently, or what you see here is my test terrain piece. My final version will have the water feature curving around so it looks a bit more natural, and probably a bit more toning in the blue so it looks a bit more like a real water feature. Now for the instructions of how to make it. Now the base of this terrain piece is felt. In this case blue felt, which I purchased from a craft shop in an A-form format. The felt in this case was a bit thick, so I'll try thinner felt in the future, and I do have some thinner felt which I purchased from a place where women go to purchase cloth to make dresses, which is not a place I normally frequent, but it's got a great range of felt. But now the reason why I use felt base is that this terrain sticks to my fine turf covered area as if it was, like Gore-Tex. And this is rather important as you will not risk the terrain moving while you're playing a game. Now I've got a playing mat, which is a nice smooth surface with beautiful terrain in it, and every time I put some sort of feature on it, it's very easy to slide around. Now the pool liner idea would probably work better on that because it's basically a piece of rubber-like material which would have a bit of sticking ability. But anyway, in this case, if your terrain is a fine turf covered piece of terrain, having felt will allow it to stick on it fairly nicely. As you can see here, my terrain is on probably a 60-degree angle and the river is not flowing out. Now once I have this felt, I use PVC glue. I glue 200 GSI paper to the felt. In my case I'm using a A4 sheet of paper. Now coloured blue cardboard, as long as it's not too thick, would also be suitable. Once dry, I then paint it whatever colour I desire. In this case, the blue is what I use for water features when I embed them in my fine turf terrain pieces. You can make it look nicer by painting other features, different shades of blue, contrast, textures, etc. Once the paint is dry, I then give the A4 sheet of paper, and at this point it's an A4 sheet of paper, it's not been cut, a coat of water-based varnish. It's the same kind of varnish that you would normally use for wooden floors. Other options is to use a gloss blue paint or the Woodlands water feature liquid, which comes in a tube or a container, which dries into a very realistic water feature type surface. Probably a lot better than what you see here. Once the clear varnish is fully dry, I then create straight pieces. In this case I cut it out. Now in this particular case I drew the lines on the blue side, which is maybe not the correct thing to do, but this was a test sheet, so as a result I didn't care that much. But as it turned out, even though I drew a very thin line along the piece that you see, when I cut it, as long as I cut very carefully along it, it pretty much disappears. Now in this case it's a straight piece, which doesn't look particularly great. In future I will cut them in a curve, which makes it a bit more tricky to draw out. So I suspect I'm going to have to make a template, which I'll carefully make, and then use that template to do my draw. Now, the ends of these water features can be also cut at an angle to allow for additional turns and curves. The result is a surprisingly stable and usable water feature which can be placed on your playing area as you desire. My next project is to create a thinner piece of water feature, possibly, when I say thinner in width, less width, either 2 centimetre or 1 centimetre, which would represent streams. The other thing I want to add, or try, is to add more detail and texture to the water feature, either by using paint or by the use of a thicker varnish or the Woodlands water feature liquid, whatever it's called. I may try clear silicone, however, every time I try and use that, it's extremely difficult to manage and apply. What I suspect you see here is something like clear silicone, which has been placed over a very nicely piece of a nice piece of terrain. Incidentally, you can purchase this, and this was my final backup strategy. However, at the present moment, getting stuff out of the US is very expensive, or almost not possible or impossible. So I'm going to wait until the postal service is a little bit more stable before I start ordering this. But in the meantime, I can create my own, as you've just seen. So we come to an end of my part 3 of my Pre-Stag series of videos. In this case, talking about converting DBMM army list into something that you can play using the Pre-Stag rules. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.